Right, it started. Now we are good.
Okay.
Now we are good. Okay, folks, I will share the screen with you because I have put up a PowerPoint presentation so that you can see some pictures, and I'm doing this PowerPoint in Italian because friends of mine helped me to translate, so you know where we are and you know what we are talking about. And again, my suggestion is whenever we're coming across a topic and you say, I don't get it, I don't understand it, just say, hey, sorry, excuse me, can you repeat or can you explain or whatever? Feel free to do that, okay? In any language, because Master George will translate from Italian to English and maybe backwards. So you have to come every session, George. Right. Okay, let's get started. I share my screen with you. There we go. And just shout out if you have a question or something. So I move you over. Well, I said welcome to our 4 lectures addressing these new forms of monasticism. This is something we will talk about a lot. New forms of monasticism and, of course, of communitarian life, expressing a very special branch of spirituality. As I said before, it is my joy and pleasure to invite you into the early modern period of Europe, since the roots of the new monasticism we experience today in the 21st century, at least in the Lutheran Church, these roots date way back into the age of Reformation. So we need to talk about old monasticism and new monasticism. And we need to talk about the changes coming from the Reformation and coming from the Lutheran idea of orders and monastic life. Now, going back to the age of Reformation, here the Apostolic and Catholic Church became 2 churches, and that has an impact on the various forms of religious life we experience. So the church became 2 churches, and later in the year 1648, a 3rd confession has been accepted within the Holy Roman Empire of German nation as well. So in the end, we've got the Lutherans, we've got the Catholic Church, of course, we've got the Lutherans, and we've got the Reformed Church. So all these people you attribute with Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin and others. And both the Lutheran and the Reformed confession not only dealt with the issue of finding their stand within the contemporary confessional landscape, they also dealt with various forms of religious and communitarian life within themselves. So the question both confessions had was, confession is one thing, but how can we put it into praxis pietatis? How can we in community live up to the confession we have? These forms indeed try to live up to a new ideal between Lutheran orthodoxy and pietistic understandings of individual religiosity, which need communion to fulfill its task, and this lay the roots for a new monastic movement within the 20th century, which will be addressed in our lecture as well. So what we're actually looking at is a very complicated thing, because on the one hand, we've got the people in the 16th century saying, we don't want these old forms of religious life anymore. And on the other hand, they are trying to suggest what new forms of life shall we have, keeping the confession we've decided to be part on. And these things, these questions and answers are the root for the Lutheran orders and the Lutheran monasticism in the 20th century. So you can see it's all linked together. And this is important to know right from the beginning. So all in all, what we are going to do through the next week is we will take the challenging task to ride through the early modern period and end up in contemporary times by discovering how forms of religious communio has not only changed, but even has managed to create new forms of communitarian life, if they were required by circumstances. So the question is, how are we going to do this? We are starting off with a huge debate, and the huge debate addresses the denial of monasticism. Luther and his companions saying, we don't need this anymore, the religious order. And as you can see, I am a Lutheran sister, so maybe Luther was wrong throughout the years. But nevertheless, it just happened. Good. The first thing we're going to talk about is the denial of monasticism, saying, no, this kind of religious life, this form of religious life, we don't need this anymore. So we've got the denial of a very specific form of communitarian life. And that means, as I said before, we start in the Reformation era, and we start a lot with the writings of Martin Luther and his encounters on monasticism, because we need to understand what was so critical about it and what new forms of religious life can come from that. Now, why are we doing this? I said it before, the fact that during the 20th century, a significant number of Lutheran orders are being founded can only be understood if Martin Luther's ideas of communitarian or even monastic life are understood properly. So in the first large chapter, we will address Luther's thinking concerning monasteries, vows, and the issue of escaping from monasteries, because during the 16th centuries, a lot of monks and nuns simply were fleeing from the monasteries, saying, we don't want to live that kind of life anymore. Working on this, we will much better understand new forms of communitarian life within the Lutheran Church. And these forms finally arose during the 20th century. Secondly, what we're going to do is we take a close look at new understandings of community, new understandings and new forms of religious life right within the 16th century. And this includes a very special setting and a very special understanding of the church as a communio sanctorum. Of course, you all know that church is regarded as communio sanctorum. This does not sound new to you, but still the term now in the 16th century has been newly adopted. Now at this time it becomes clear understanding of new communitarian traces within the early modern period might not be complete if we left out the movements which are called in research the Radical Reformation. The Radical Reformation, like Anabaptist or anti-Trinitarian movements or spiritualist movement, anything like that. And these very special groups, these movements, had a very special understanding of how to live together and how to set up a very special form of religious life. Anabaptists and spiritualists, for example, have found their own and new forms of communitarian life. They have shared a very specific understanding of communio, and despite the fact that they have been persecuted and killed, a large number of them have been persecuted and killed throughout the 16th centuries by Catholic and Lutheran authorities and churches, their understanding of the communio of believers, which transcended social and even gender hierarchies, needs to be regarded as a footstep in which evangelical communities of the 20th century actually are walking. So we can't understand the developments within the 20th century without looking at the Radical Reformation in the 16th century. And this is why we're going to do this in a second step. And there's much more to it. I'd like to add, without this egalitarian imposition, which strongly advocates, doing by the Anabaptists, which strongly advocates even the Lutheran idea of priesthood of all believers, the new communities of the 20th century might not have been the same. We will address this issue further while taking an exemplary look at the Anabaptist movement and its self-understanding during the 16th century, and we will watch out for the traces. That is our second chapter of the whole lecture. Not today, what we'll be doing throughout the next weeks. Thirdly, we will address a very special and new form of evangelical communio, a new form of religious life, but you might want to say, well, martyrs, they are dead, but it's a special form of evangelical communio, which can be traced back to the 16th century as well. As I said, the communio of evangelical martyrs. While addressing them, it will become clear where the limits of new forms of communitarian life actually lies. Still, the priesthood of all believers, which you all are probably familiar with coming from Martin Luther, still the priesthood of all believers was in charge. But nevertheless, this idea usually collided, and probably still collides, with social and cultural hierarchies, which are set up in society to ensure preserving traditional views on, for instance, gender, virtues, and attitudes. Moreover, the communio of martyrs was new to evangelical Christians because, Lutherans don't deal so much with holiness and saints and martyrs, but now they had to because they had their own martyrs in their own movement. And consequently, their way of setting up a culture of remembrance, and that's what we're going to look at, setting up a culture of remembrance around these martyrs, around these evangelical saints, if you wish, suggest that this new form was supposed to strengthen and support old forms of communio within the earthly boundaries. That sounds a bit awkward, I know, but in fact, I'd like to point out in this chapter that many evangelical writings say, okay, in death you are all the same, and we've got an egalitarian view, like men and women are probably the same in death, but still in the culture of remembrance, in the Lutheran culture of remembrance, this gender hierarchy was re-established, and I will point out to you how this was managed, showing you that this special communio of martyrs, special form, new form of religious life, still reflects the earthly boundaries and hierarchies and so forth. It wasn't paradise. It was pretty earthly, to be honest. And fourthly, we will pack up everything we have learned from the 16th and even 17th century and jump straight into the 20th century in order to find out how the legacy of the Reformation era was put into practice here, how it was put into practice when new evangelical orders arose. And they did. And in my person, you can see that they are still existing. We are doing this. While doing this, we will be having a tiny stopover at the pietistic movement of the 17th and 18th century in order to pick up the need to individualistic belief and inner healing, which seems to undermine the understanding of communio. So I'm addressing the 17th and 18th century in our lecture because when we're talking about new forms of religious life, we usually think in terms of communio. So people get together and they put up a communio. But on the other hand, you've always got people who say, no, we don't need a communio. What we need is an individualistic faith. What we need is a very personal relationship to God. It's like today, a very personal relationship to God. And I don't need church. I don't need communio. I don't need anything. It just everything that surrounds me, like communio, has to optimize my personal faith. And this is an attitude we find in the 17th and in the 18th century in Lutheran, in evangelical movements in a way. And it is important to follow both traces, to follow the idea of, yes, we need a new form and we need it as a communio. And on the other hand, we need this individualistic approach. And then you bring both together and you end up in the 20th century. And finally, in this chapter, we also come across new forms of monastic life within the Lutheran Church, which has emerged, I said it already, after the Second World War. Here we need to take a look at the debates occurring and dating back to the 16th century, while also working on the specific circumstances of Germany, because most of the orders, the evangelical orders, do exist in Germany during and after the NS regime, after the Nazi regime, the National Social Democrats. These circumstances are highly important. I'm talking about the 1930s and 1940s. These circumstances are highly important since they shape the emerging evangelical orders and their understanding of communio a great deal. It wouldn't have been the same if the Dritte Reich, the Third Reich, hadn't happened. Because this understanding, the Nazi understanding of communio, differs highly from the understanding of communio these new evangelical, these new Lutheran orders wanted to put into practice. In fact, these orders can be understood as an answer to the barbaric forms of communitarian life and communio which have been issued during the Third Reich. Moreover, the spiritual struggle between good and evil might be another trace that lights up here. And this will remind us, when we're talking about that in that chapter, this will remind us that any monastic form of life does and should not live up to its self-purpose. It's always for somebody else. It's for God and it's for the people. So any form of monastic life does and should not live up to its self-purpose, but rather strike for unity and for making a difference in the visible and in the invisible world. That's the point, and this is something they did wrong in a way during the Third Reich. And finally, and it will be the end in January, finally, I would like to introduce to a category in research that tries to knit a net between various new and old forms of communitarian life. It is the category of ecumenical friendship. That's the basis, and I mean, we're talking about interconfessional theology. So I'd like to introduce to you the category of ecumenical friendship as a category in research, as well as a category in life. And we will entertain this category at the very end of our lectures, because it can be understood as a prospect of unity to come, like Pope Francis has put out in Fratelli Tutti, saying, you know, we're talking about brotherhood and sisterhood, and my idea is to say, yes, Pope Francis, you are right, but let us talk about friendship as well, and let us talk about ecumenical friendship in the sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, and let us understand that this category might form a new way, a new form of religious life, and maybe also a new form of church, of one church perhaps. Well, as I said, even newer forms of communitarian life derive from that Who knows? And we'll find out in January when we're having our last encounter. The unity which underlines the understanding of friendship might be enforced by social developments like shrinking communities. We are all losing not the faith, but the people. And maybe that's one reason we need to talk about ecumenical friendship. So developments like shrinking communities and their overaging. All of you who know the developments in orders, having a high average age, and the future is unknown. But still, it might also be issued, the category of friendship might also be issued by a new and deeper sense of unity which leaves confessional boundaries aside in order to fulfill the common task God has passed over to various confessions and forms of life. Why should we think about differences? Why don't we think about unity on the basis of friendship? That is the question behind that. Friendship in this sense of understanding each other as sisters and brothers, despite origin or confession, is, I said it already, not only addressed by Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, which I will mention briefly in that chapter, it also relies on the research of friendship coming from monastic theologians. So we're not starting at point zero, we're relying on the Pope and we're relying on monastic theologians. Therefore, it might be helpful to plant this particular seed for further forms of monastic and religious life by addressing the power of ecumenical friendship, encouraging you as rising theologians to entertain this trace further. Now, these are the five fields we will be walking on during the next weeks. It will be a journey and at some points, even an adventure, I guess. While walking this path together, we will have plenty of time to listen to developments between the 16th and 20th century, but I would also like to encourage you to present your question. I said it before, but strongly encourage you to present your question and doubts if existing. So whenever questions arise, just to make this sure, feel free to interrupt and feel free to ask. And I am very willing to take some breaks in the lecture to give you the opportunity to ask questions. And whenever we're coming back from our big break, for 10 minutes big break, then feel free to ask the question that turned up. I am very positive that we will get on well together. And now let us go to work. And we start with the first chapter. Before we are entering the 16th century, I would like to emphasize why it is so important, and this is chapter 0 if you wish, why it is so important to deal with forms of communitarian, of religious life, and why we should always assume that communitarian life keeps renewing itself and therefore needs to be studied constantly. It needs to renew itself or it's going to die, like every religious life and every form of religious life. And therefore it needs to be studied constantly. Among the fundamental questions that arise in this context, which were already debated at the beginning of monastic forms of life and have lost none of their topicality to this day, one of the fundamental questions is the question how significant communio is in the shaping of individual spirituality. Oh God, in shaping individual spirituality. More concretely, how do religious experience, individual religious experience, and communio relate to each other? Do they fit or don't they do this? Is there a mutual exclusion or a mutual inspiration? Or is the experience of the individual perhaps highly necessary for the communio as such, just as communio may be indispensable for the experience of the religious, of the individual religious? So what can we tell about the relationship between individual faith and communio? Because if we are not talking about this, then we don't need to talk about new forms of religious life, because then we would say, okay, you've got the individual, that's it, and everybody has his or her own experiences, but they don't get together and they don't commit themselves to a communio. These questions, I guess, are especially significant today because at present, and you all know that, new emergent spiritual communities and movements, such as the Houses of Prayer movement or young communities, offer and provide a more or less unifying collective. But they do understand this more in the sense of a post-traditional and therefore new form of communio. So what I'm talking about are like the prayer houses we have in Germany, in Freiburg and in Leipzig and in Augsburg and other places, where young people get together saying, yes, this is some kind of communio, but still they are going there for their individual sake. So that they are not sort of living together, they're just sharing an experience for a moment together. They're doing worship, they're doing prayer together, and they are touched emotionally by this, deeply touched emotionally by this, and then they return home, and there's no commitment to communio. There's just, sort of experience, and that's about it. So that's the reason why I say these prayer houses propose or suggest a post-traditional and therefore new form of communio, because it's not the way probably we would like or we would think about communitarian life, like, being together, sharing time and space, sharing faith, sharing prayer for a lifetime. No. That is to say, one's own individual experience of faith, and that's the focus of this movement, one's own individual experience of faith is located in a semi-public space, and this is regarded as so crucial that communio as such appears to be only indirectly significant, and if at all, in the sense of a vehicle. It helps you to get an individual experience. And to be more precise about this, and we're talking about today, more precisely, communio's function is sometimes exhausted in providing the space and the atmosphere in which the individual can make essential experiences for himself in order, and I would put it in such strong words, in order to optimize himself spiritually. So it's an understanding of I'm optimizing myself, and that's the new form of religious life, optimizing the individual faith. But in the end, communio does not appear to be essential. It just provides the room for a very special moment in time to serve the individual. This observation, and I would like to introduce you to this observation fits in with talking of a plural and at the same time liquid society in the sense of Zygmunt Bauman and Martin Schüssler. So you've got a theologian, Martin Schüssler, and you've got a sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, and they are talking about the liquid society. There are not many aspects left that are safe or that are ask you to commit yourself and go on for a long time with that. No, it's a liquid society in which even the individual experiences of the gospel becomes, through a growing liquidity tolerance, an event. even the experiences of the gospel becomes an event. And this is how Michael Schüssler actually says it. Even reading the gospel is an event, and then you leave it. And you are emotionally attached, and then later detached, and then you leave it. It's an event. And this is you having the idea of an event is due to the idea that we've got some kind of liquidity tolerance in today's time. So even the experience of the gospel becomes an event that is solely situational and that is not located in a binding communio and thus can also be made fruitful for other people. No, it's just for you and it's just for the moment. In concrete terms, therefore, it is about one's own, in this case, religious state of mind, and less about a common action in and with the communio, and certainly not about an action guiding collective spirituality. And I guess this marks the major change we are discovering right now. New forms of religious life not necessarily need to be shared in communitarian life. You can have it as an individual, solely individual experience, and that's about it. And maybe this is one of the major differences we have when we're looking at the 21st century and compared to the time before. This is one of the major changes of today, I guess. In the following, what I'm saying in the following, however, I don't want to sort of play off individual religious experiences against the communion in order to speak in this way of the experience cleansing tradition of a communio or a dogma. In fact, I want to get it together again because I believe it's highly important to get it together. So the opposite is the case. It is necessary to accentuate the interplay between solitary and common search for meaning. And you folks, you're studying interconfessional theology, so you should be highly interested in the interplay on various levels. And I'm suggesting to you that you also have to keep in mind the interplay between solitary and common search for meaning in the footsteps of religious theology in order to make clear that locating the individual in a binding communio has, in the best sense, a corrective effect and therefore serves the individual biographies of faith. Therefore, I would like to put the thesis forward to you that a binding communio offers a valuable contribution to the spirituality of individuals. In other words, it is helpful to be part of a team. This insight is helpful not only for shaping and judging the present upheavals of churches, denominations, and individual search for meaning, because it points to the fact that lived communio provides an elaborate frame of reference. And that's the point I'm going to make. A lived communio, a praying community, a committed communio provides an elaborate frame of reference, which in the best sense serves the discernment of spirits and thus helps to come to decisions by shaping the individual spiritual life. In other words, the individual needs the communio in order to discern the spirits. In order to clarify the interplay of individual experience and communio in the sense of this thesis, I would like to add some insights from the monastic theology of the Middle Ages and reflections of religious as well as religious rules of all denominations from the beginning of monasticism way up to the present. But before I do this, I would like to ask you, are you still okay or shall we have a break? How does it feel?
Maybe it is better have a break.
Okay, good. Then we're having a break and then we turn to the monastic theology. So let me say I stop that so I can see you all. We see us again at 3 o'clock. Okay?
Okay.
10 minutes break.
Thank you.
See you back at 10 o'clock. I'm sorry, at 3 o'clock. Let's
Thank
put
you
it
very
this.
much. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, 3 o'clock. There you go. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Before we go on, are there any questions in any language? No questions?
I just have a curiosity.
Yes.
Could you tell 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 us something about you, about your experience, please?
Sure.
If you can.
I
of
can.
course.
I can, and I will. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't do that before that. As you can see, to start with that, I'm a Lutheran sister, so I'm part of a Lutheran evangelical order that was founded in the year 1948, 1949, but I am a sister for 13 years now. And my profession is, I'm not a theologian, I'm a historian. I'm a historian for the early modern period in Europe. So the period between 1500 and 1815. And I am working about Central Europe, and I'm working about confessional identities in that period of time. And I'm also, and that was my second study, I also studied Japanese. This is a bit awkward, but I studied Japanese because, like you, I like the dialogue between cultures. And I know how important the dialogue between cultures is. So I thought Japan and Europe, that's a good way to dialogue because the Asian context is so different. So I enjoy that. And the third trace is I'm passionate about ecumenical friendship. I'm very passionate about that. And I guess that is one of the reasons why I am doing this course here. I have actually no idea who said we want her at the course. And I just got the letter saying, hey, and it doesn't say, hey, but do you want to be part of this? And I thought that's brilliant. I mean, offering a course about interconfessional dialogue and, well, interconfessional theology is just great. And you all just said it already. In contemporary times today, we cannot do without. We cannot do without it. You need the approach of dialogue today because no church can live and survive on his or her own. You sort of desperately need the dialogue. And last point I'd like to make, it's not only a dialogue because we are in need, because churches are declining. It's also important because by the biblical promissio, or by the biblical, we are called by the biblical word to work together and to collect God's people and get together. So I'm very passionate about this, and that's the reason why I'm very happy to be here. Is that okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right, then let's get back to the individual and the collective spirituality. And I torture you with some more information about this. And I'm sharing the screen again, and and let's see where it gets us. Hang on a second. So this is where we actually have been. And we've been to Sigmund Baumann already and Michael Schüssler already, and we are approaching Ludger Schulte in a moment. So we put it this way. And again, whenever you say, hey, I've got a question, just interrupt. Feel free to interrupt. Now, we were coming from the point saying, yeah, today's form of spirituality and confessional identity is pretty individual. And we're discussing the fact that maybe the individual also needs communio, needs the group, needs the confessional identity which is presented by the group. And now allow me to exemplarily examine this question with regard to the coexistence and or opposition of solitary and common search for meaning by looking at the theology of the monastic theology of the Middle Ages and some contemporary folks of the theology of orders. Why did I choose this way to walk you into the question of solitary and common spirituality and its very specific forms of communitarian life? The answer is, I believe that if you look at religious rules, rules of the orders, you get a good basis for this because they are not only normative, you need to do this and that, but they also reflect in a very condensed way the conditions in a binding communio living together. In other words, religious or rules of orders reflect the relationship between the individual and the communio. So these rules are equally concerned with individual religious experiences as well with the possibilities and limits of communio. And that is, I guess, for our question today, very important. And of course, everybody of you who's living in communio knows this is always a tension, a very big tension. But this tension provides the opportunity to constantly reflect on the form of communitarian life. Does it require renewal? Do we need new forms of religious life? And what happens if new aspects are added by new members? Or like you in the Catholic Church, what difference does it make if church suddenly moves together and the Pope says, you know what, let's understand ourselves as a synod and start doing this worldwide synod process? Does it make a difference to feel that kind of communio? So what happens if new aspects are added by new members? And against this background, it is clear that the choice of rules used here in the following is determined by the intensity with which they address communio, because not in all times it was equally important to ask about the relationship between individual and common search for meaning. But today it is. And I wonder what reason we find for this, but that's probably another question. Now we're getting into this. The importance of communio for the solitary search for meaning can hardly be overestimated. And yet it was and is only popular at certain times. This refers to the rather wave-like formation of communio structures and the more intensive reflection on them in monasticism, in monasteries, at Luther's so-called third place, we're going to look at soon, a third place that collects the willing and the praying. If you find certain reflection in pietism, in communities of semi-religious people, as we discover them in the Catholic tradition like Mary Ward or Angela Merici. We discover them in deaconess communities in Protestantism during the 19th century and in secular institutes of the 19th century, or in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Finkenwalde Seminary in the Lutheran Church during the Third Reich. This all has been set up during the NS regime, offering theologians the chance to live and pray together in order to undermine the NS system by setting up one's own structure and communio. As you can imagine, this project has failed and was quickly shut down by the officials of the Nazi regime. But what I want to point out, we have certain waves in which we discuss the question, what's the relationship between the individual and the communio, and what new forms of religious life derive from that. It is clear that new communities have become established, at least for a certain period of time, when there have been major upheavals in the state, particular social hardships, or a growing need for new forms of spiritual life, and thus major changes in the church. So new forms of religious life, I guess, only appear when something is wrong, either in the state or in the church. And we can discuss that if you want, but I guess that's a very important aspect. For example, the recognition of Protestant religious congregations after the year 1979 initially went hand in hand with realizing that a new and almost revolutionary need for spirituality had arisen in the midst of the church, which apparently could no longer be fully served by the congregations, by the parishes. Instead, the focus was now on locations of grace, as it has been put in the Lutheran Church, on locations of grace where spirituality was not only a topic, but was also lived out in a sustainable way. Henceforth, evangelical orders, or communities as we used to call them, were regarded as such places because they said, and now I quote from various writings, they set a radical sign for life in the face of another reality. Yes, that's a good way of describing orders, setting a radical sign for life in the face of another reality. And this sign was desperately needed. The church needed this sign, and they, the communities, fulfilled this desire, and they still do this. So the observation that the longing for and the shaping of communio precisely returns in precarious situations of upheaval in state or in church suggests that communio should be understood as, and now we're getting there, as the basic code of the Christian culture of life, in the sense of the Capuchin and Catholic theologian of religious orders, Ludger Schulte. I don't know if there are some writings in Italian by him, but if you can get hold of this, try to and read it. So, communio shall be understood as the basic code of the Christian culture of life. And for it is precisely in communio, according to Schulte, that the space opens up that shows, and now I quote him, what the Christian faith is all about. And it is precisely this that was and is needed and, as it were, actualized in precarious situations. So whenever there's a need due to upheaval, then there's also a need to reinvent communio. Of course, we can now easily draw the conclusion that a spiritual answer of communitarian life needs to change with the circumstances given. If during times of upheaval, the communities do not care about the social and cultural environment they are placed in, they could not provide an answer to the needs of the time. And here we've got a major question of church. Do we as a church today provide an answer to the needs of the time? If not, we're going to be outdated soon. Therefore, if communio cannot provide the answer, it is destined to die. This means that renewal should be the constant battle to fulfill the task orders and any kind of religious communio are sent to do and provide. So, forms of religious life always has to renew itself because we always have to answer the questions of the circumstances and the time we're actually living in. While the context thus provides the occasion for the foundation or actualization of a communio according to Schulte, the spirituality that is then carried out as an expression of Christian culture of life is primarily based on its reconnection to God. He, God, is understood as an ingredient of mutual dependence and is thus conceived as communal and communio founding in itself. So we always have to return back to the idea God has given us by himself, saying, look, it's three of us, but we are one. So that's the basic idea of communio. For this very reason, communio is destined to unity in diversity and to diversity out of unity. Big task for churches, big task for every form of religious life. Communio is always destined to unity in diversity and to diversity out of unity, as Schulte puts it. In this, however, the difference between God and human beings is not abolished, but rather unity arises from participation in the common. I think this is an amazing way of describing God. And at the same time, it marks an ecumenical position, which has also found its way into Protestant religious orders and rules. And I'd like to exemplify this by a look at the religious rule of the Fraternity of Christ, my community, the so-called Christusbruderschaft Selbitz, and the rule is from the year 1999. And as I said, we are a religious order within the Lutheran Church. Here in this rule, it is emphasized that the triune God is indeed the reason for the unity of the communio, and God calls out of itself to the acceptance of diversity. So unity always means putting diversity into it and living up to the ideal of diversity. From this, the ecumenical basis mission of the communio arises, stating that communio constantly, and I said it before, that communio constantly needs to renew itself while keeping an eye on its ecumenical partners and faith. So let me sum this up. We've got the situation in society we are living in. We've got the upheavals. We've got the necessity to find an answer with our form of religious life. And while considering this, we are realizing that we can only give an answer if we change and if we renew ourselves constantly. And that's the last point, and this is an ecumenical task, because in the end, it's all of us on the move. So coming from that idea, we can see that communio is not set as an ontological quantity. On the contrary, it is and remains changeable and renewable, because it is always the product of concrete interests and work of the members and the circumstances given. This work, and I mean by work, I mean the understanding of the members, what's going on in the world, and what can we do and what shall we do. This work with and on each other arises when the members understand themselves not only by their reference to God. Moreover, they should see each other as people naturally striving for communio, while this process and striving is accompanied by, of course, power interests and ways to consider them and deal with them. The fact that every relationship in different terms, but nevertheless in the last instance, is a relationship based on power and hierarchy, becomes apparent while looking at the life of a communio. One may state that Christians should know it better. Not play the power game, but Christians should know it better. In fact, they do not do this, as Pope Francis has stated in Fratelli Tutti, when he mentioned that being a Christian does not mean to live the Christian way. And that's a very good insight, I think, he provides. Knowing that being a Christian does not mean to live the Christian way. So we take part in this power game. This understanding of communio and power and hierarchy suggests that the relationship between communio and individual should be seen as a relationship full of tension and power. After all, here two significant quantities come together in order to recognize and interpret meaning of faith and life, and to derive insights and actions from it in an obligatory way. And indeed, medieval orders as well as monastic communities of the present day were and are not immune to the fact that the actually desired we, and that's what we are all about, that the actually desired we they need and provide can quickly become a theological ideology that lets the individual sink in the we and thereby getting lost. So the tension is that Communio says, look, it's us and we are on our way. And the individual says, hey, wait, I'd like to be myself within a Communio. And then the Communio sort of reaches out, and the danger is that the individual sinks in. And if the individual sinks in, then it cannot change or cannot provide new ideas of Communio. And a Communio that sort of sucks up every individual will not renew itself. And indeed, medieval orders as well as monastic communities of the present day were and are not immune to these things happening, this sucking in of the individual. But just as little is the danger of the late modern talk of individualization and setting one's own experience of faith as absolute. This needs to be dismissed too, since it possibly trivializes the we. So the tension is not only that the we sucks up the individual, it's also the tension between the individual that's too individual in a way. The cohesive forces of a communio, its competence in communication, and its conflict management strategies must be well developed in order to prevent or contain the strengthening of such exclusion mechanism and ultimately of power struggles. If they're not doing this, a communio can neither fulfill its function of order inwardly, nor can it provide its service outwardly, and would then be no help for the individual's search for meaning. But to help in the search of meaning is a timeless task. This is what we are there for, of spiritual communities. And now you can see, if you don't renew yourself, you can't find the struggle and you can't fulfill this timeless task of spiritual communities. Here you can see that constant renewal on the basis of the promise that was granted to the communio is its major task. If renewal is not put into practice, any religious communio, any church, or even church will be lost. This is something I suggest. Any church will be lost. The reference to and tension between individual and communio was already addressed, and now we're coming to that in early monasticism and clearly in the monastic theology of the Middle Ages. Both state how important it was and still is to keep an eye on it. More precisely, already in late antique Syrian monasticism, there was the position that God used religious events, remember the prayer houses, that God used religious events such as the spectacle of the column Saint Simeon to gather individuals, in this case the harmless in faith, and to counteract the inertia on the path of faith. Whoever criticized this with reference to a lack of sustainability in faith and to the idea that an event cannot support a sustainable faith, since the individual experience of faith finds no lasting concreteness in the communion, could and should be dismissed, and I quote from the sources, as a grumbling spoon. In short, the unique experiences related to the individual, and thus also the event was needed, both was needed, and so we are back to the tension. No doubt about this. However, stating this should not marginalize communio. On the contrary, the need for communio should also be strengthened, and there's much more to this. The individual experience should be embedded into communio to fully come to life. That's what it's all about. The individual experience should be embedded into the communio to fully come to life and to shape a new form of life. Nevertheless, the experiences and thus the desire for further experiences should always precede the embedding into the communio. Anything else, so the position can be sharpened, would be in danger of the I being submerged in the theological ideology of the we. And this should not happen. Individuals and individual belief have to remain free. Instead, communio needs to be on the move. It has to keep in mind that it constantly has to walk the path of renewal, and this addresses the structures as well as its theology. So that's the basic point behind that. And any communio which has understood this will make sure that it is on the move. And it will make sure that things turn out to be new and new forms of religious life evolve. I'm finishing it up by looking into the medieval ages. The tense interplay between individual experience and communio has been further considered and differentiated in the monastic theology following early monasticism. The medieval theologian and monk father Bernard of Clairvaux, Bernardo di Chiaravalle, was the inspiration for this in a very special way. The theologian Ulrich Köpf, German theologian, has elaborated Bernard's theology of religious experience, and by doing this, thus placed a filled concept of experience clearly before Martin Luther. Too bad for all the evangelicals, because we always thought that Martin Luther was the first dealing with experience. In fact, he wasn't. So Ulrich Köpf said, look, there's a theology about experience we can share with any group, with any communio, and this theology of experiences is clearly needs to be placed before Martin Luther, who has been attributed to have turned experience into a constitutive object of theology before that. Well before Luther, namely in the early 12th century, Bernardo has set up his concept of experience following John Cassian, systematically arguing with the pillars of self-knowledge and knowledge of God. That's how he sort of addresses experience, individual experience. He's talking about self-knowledge, I know myself pretty well, and the knowledge of God, something I can assume God is. Both the self-knowledge and the knowledge of God were essential to his concept. For Bernardo, religious experience is exclusively a primary experience. That means it arises from the immediate contact and takes place in the interior, the inner self of the experiencing subject, who experiences this experiences as a counter experience beyond rationality. If you want to put it in simple words, it just happened. And you feel something like, oh, something is happening and I can't put it in rational terms. Therefore, the person getting involved into God's sphere is passive. It's passive in experiencing and perceives only the working of a foreign power. To make this process and experiences clear, Bernardo used numerous metaphors of food and taste. And I like that very much because it shows you how he sort of digests the experiences he's gaining. He's talking about these metaphors of food and taste. He's concerned with the taste of the inner experience, with the digestion of what has been experienced, with the pleasant smell of what has been absorbed. And all this makes it clear that religious experience in this diction is a deeply individual experience, even if it arises from the action of a counterpart and possibly leads to a communitarian life. The counterpart that gives rise to this experience, however, is perceived only in its effect. We don't see him, we just feel the effect of it. That's how Bernardo puts it. It's not a full physical presence, it's just an experience. This might sound weird, but it tells us something about God's privilege to disguise himself. Of course, we cannot see him, but we can experience him if he allows us to feel him. At the latest, communio comes into play when it comes to the sustainable interpretation of this raw material of experience just gained here. So the individual experiences something, and now we've got the communio coming up. Here, according to Bernardo, the different and even foreign experience of a communio, we have a tradition of putting experiences into language. This foreign experience of the communio, already sedimented by history and tradition, the different language, sometimes also the authority of the communio, and always the help is needed to interpret and ultimately understand what has been experienced. So it gets together here. We were talking about the tension before, and now we're talking about the fact that it's getting together and might form a new form of religious life. More precisely, it is a matter of a different experience to help the understanding subject to come to his own new experiences, because only by this event, by this process, it becomes possible that the handed down experiences gains relevance, that it gains relevance and can shape the spiritual life of the individual. So the authority of communio is limited to help the individual, nothing more and nothing less. It's the job of the communio to help the individual to understand the experience and to give some relevance to the experience. That's what it's all about. Only by this event, by this process, it becomes possible, as I said, that the handed down experiences gains the relevance it actually needs. In other words, it is clear that one's own experiences continue to be understood as the author of relevance and certainty on an individual basis. We are not putting this tension between individual and communio apart. In fact, we limit the opportunities of both, and we say they both need to get together to put some relevance to the individual experience. At the same time, the individual also needs and still needs the external experience provided by the communio in order to adequately understand what has been experienced, and how this can be put into words and have a lasting impact on one's own spiritual life. This process of negotiation that needs to be done now should serve the individual's search for meaning and not the imposition of communal positions. It should always serve the individual. And that makes clear that the process of negotiation, potential spiritual abuse, and the unhealthy exercise of power relations were and are separated by sometimes very narrow ridge. Communio helps, but it can also abuse the individual. Communities always need to be cautious about this and need to add a huge amount of sensitivity to the agenda of renewal, because they always have to keep in mind what they're doing to the individual. Nevertheless, the concept, now we are putting it together. Nevertheless, the concept of communio needs not to be exhausted in the provision of a corrective external experience. The monk Martin Luther, and there he is, went one step further here by making it clear that the deed that emerges from experiences should also aim at and shape communio. So it's going back from the individual to communio. Specifically, he demanded that nobody should be seduced by the focus on Christ, faith, and the Holy Scriptures, and therefore lead a life as an island and thus isolate himself and refrain from references to the world. So what Luther actually saying is, it's good to have individual experiences, but don't keep it for yourself. You're not called to keep it for yourself. That's the basic point behind that. Rather, you use it especially towards your neighbor. And Luther summarized this idea in his writing in the year 1520. He's writing about the liberty of a Christian, and he states a very famous sentence here, and I share it with you in German, but I explain it to you, well, in Luther's German, but I think you should just see it because it's directly from the sources. So it says, ein Christenmensch ist ein freier Herr über alle Dinge und niemand untertan. Ein Christenmensch ist ein dienstbar Knecht aller Dinge und jedermann untertan. What are we reading here? We are reading a Christian believer is an absolutely free person and not called to be obedient to anyone. So far, so good. But at the same time, we also read a Christian believer is also a servant and called to be obedient to everybody. So on the one hand, he's absolutely free and not called to be obedient. On the other hand, he's a servant and called to be obedient to everybody. This sounds pretty weird, but still it is the key to a communio that takes the individual seriously. This means that anyone who has once, as an individual, experienced the joyful change, as Luther puts it, between Christ and the soul in faith, would not be able to do otherwise than to become to his neighbor the Christ that Christ had become to him. He's driven to do so. The experiences drives him to act like this. Now let me explain this, because here we've got the theology of justification coming up, explaining how individual and communio are linked together. The basic idea of the writing is this. We've got the sinful individual and we've got Christ. And at some moment, Luther says, they get together. They get together because by grace, God says, okay, look, you individual, I want to be part of your life and I want to change your life. So in Christ and in the incarnation and in the crucifixion and in the resurrection of Christ, Christ enters into the life of the people. He sort of gets together with the soul of the people and he shares the gifts of God with the people. That's the idea of justification. So me as a sinful person, I see, oh yeah, I'm sinful and there's no way to help me. And then Christ gets into my life and says, you know what? I share the heavenly goods with you and I share my power of resurrection with you. So he takes up all the bad stuff from my soul and we sort of exchange. The soul gets the good stuff of Christ and Christ gets the bad stuff of the soul. So, and God has decided, yeah, I want this happen like that because in my grace, I decide that's going to happen. And my only job as a person, as an experiencing and believing individual is to believe that. My only job in life is to believe. That's the point behind that. And now you might understand why Luther can say in the year 1520, look, if this happens, if this exchange happens, then you should be very, very happy and very, very glad about this. And you are free. You are absolutely free. And since you are free, you can willingly submit yourself to all the other people and to the job you need to do in society. So your inner person, as Luther says it, your inner person is absolutely free because you've got an experience of Christ, and therefore you can open up to the world and say, you know what? I'm a servant to everyone because nobody can rob my freedom. Nobody can rob the dignity I have gained in this joyful change, as Luther has put it. So you've got a crash course in the idea of justification now, which is not pretty bad to know that, but it links, I'm explaining this because it links the individual and the communio together, and it shows you if this happens, and if you closely believe that this happens, then you cannot but renew communio every second, because you're living from this inner liberty, from this inner freedom, and that makes you aware of the fact of what surrounds you. It makes you aware of the circumstances that surround you, and you will always say, you know what? I'm free to act. I'm free to act because I'm not acting because I want some dignity and friendship or whatsoever. No, I'm acting because a huge amount of grace has been granted to me. And so I love this, like Luther says, so I can become the Christ, getting to my neighbor, I can become the Christ that Christ had become to me. That's a nice way of putting it. I'm finishing up. The experience is therefore important in this context, and it is an experience is marked as salvific when then, however, frees us just as directly to act for our neighbor. In this way, in all clarity, a very broad concept of communio emerges here, which reaches beyond the immediate external experience providing reference group. Nevertheless, this is an understanding that also corresponds very much to the Protestant Church of the 20th century, which in its reflection on spirituality began in the 1970s, emphasizing the connection between spiritual depth and lived responsibility for the world. In the Lutheran Church, it always goes together. You've got the idea of deep spiritual experiences, but it always goes together with responsible behavior towards and in the world. I might stop here due to the time and due to the massive input I have just given to you. And the remaining 2 minutes, feel free to ask questions. Something unclear, something you'd like to add, something that was really wrong or different from another point of view. Is there anything you like to add? Well, if not, then we do stop here for today, I'd say. And next week, we're moving on to the rest of this chapter and then further on to chapter 2, addressing the various different forms of communion in the 16th century, like the Anabaptists and all these revolutionary guys, to give you some, gender hierarchy breaking ideas of religious forms of life, which is quite cool. And yeah, I wish you a very pleasant week, and I see you again on next Tuesday. Be blessed and have a good week.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.